So, how was Jefferson going to rule? How was he going to operate as a president? Now, we already talked about the fact that he was discovering on pretty much a daily basis that theory and reality were two very different things. And so, we're going to talk a little bit here about Jeffersonian restraint. Now, Jefferson, remember, was very much a believer in what was referred to as strict constructionism, the idea that unless the Constitution said it was permissible, then it was not allowed. And so he's going to use the powers granted him as president under the Constitution for a number of issues. And then later on in the presidency, there are going to be some things come up that he actually operates beyond what was specifically stated in the Constitution, even though he did question the constitutionality of it. One of the powers that the president has is the power to grant pardons. Okay, if you are convicted of a crime and you feel that you've been convicted unfairly, you can appeal, and if you're still there after a certain amount of, all your appeals have been exhausted, you can always apply for what's referred to as executive clemency. You can apply to the White House Office of Pardons asking for the president to pardon you of any and all crimes. If the president does issue a pardon, then it's the equivalent of that never even happened. And every president goes through and does this. Generally speaking, a lot of presidents have gone through in the last hours of their final days in office, and they have, really, pardoned a great number of people. Jefferson is going to use this power. And it's all going to go back, if you remember, to the Sedition Act. Remember, we talked about the Alien and Sedition Acts. Well, remember, under the Sedition Act, you could be put in prison because you said something mean about the president in a newspaper. And again, I mentioned this before, if you think that seems like a violation of freedom of speech or freedom of the press, you would be correct in that. So Jefferson is going to pardon those who were actually serving time under the Sedition Act. If you had been arrested, if you had been put in prison because of the Sedition Act, then he's going to go through and he will grant you a presidential pardon. Okay? And in fact, in 1802, he signs into law a new naturalization process that, remember how we said originally it had been 5 years, and then with the Alien Act, they upped it to you had to be here 14 years before you could become a citizen. Jefferson returned it back to 5 years. Now, a lot of this is being done through actual legislation. Today, we would see a lot of this happen through something called executive orders, where the president just, orders something and it acts like a law, even though it isn't really a law. But Jefferson, in this case, the presidential pardon thing, yeah, he could do that totally on his own. But in regards to changing laws, he had to get the support of both houses of Congress to do this. Now, granted, all you had to get was a simple majority, 50% plus one, and you could go through and get any law changed, and he would sign those into effect. So he is working under the Constitution, not just with the presidential pardon aspect of it, but he's working with Congress to change the various laws. Okay. Another thing that he did away with was the excise tax. Okay. Remember, we had that put in place under Mr. Hamilton. He didn't like it that much, so he got rid of it. But in all honesty, that's about the only part of the Hamiltonian system that he did get rid of. Now remember, Jefferson and Hamilton are diametrically opposite of one another. Hamilton wanted us to be a manufacturing nation. Jefferson wanted us to be an agricultural nation. The system that Hamilton put into place, Jefferson did not care for this in any way, shape, or form. However, you might notice that Jefferson did keep most of it. Now, as president, he could have gone through and worked very hard to totally overturn the system that Hamilton had put into place. But he chose not to. He chose to hold on to that system. Again, we're seeing a president who had campaigned in one voice, now seeing that reality is somewhat different and having to, sort of work on what his plans are. This isn't necessarily saying, today we would argue that this was a flip-flop. Perhaps you could still make that argument. But at the same time, my personal opinion on this is that he came into office with a great deal of understanding of how everything was supposed to work. And then you met the real world, and you had to re-examine how you want to go about doing things. He understood that how he wanted the nation to be, but he also understood the needs of the nation at the time. And so as such, even though he was not a fan and had not supported the Hamiltonian system, he did keep it in place. Okay, he did get rid of the excise tax, but other than that, that was it. Okay? Now, at this time, you're also going to see a new Secretary of the Treasury. Now, every president has had a cabinet since George Washington. We mentioned this previously. And every president gets to choose his cabinets, his cabinet secretaries. As long as you get the advice and consent of the Senate, today that we know those are Senate confirmation hearings, you can go through and you can pick just about anybody. And so he's going to get a new Secretary of the Treasury. And I will most likely butcher his name because it is of French origin. I do not speak French. I have a minor in German. If it was a Germanic name, I could pronounce that better than you can imagine. But with French, not so much. So he's going to get a new Secretary of the Treasury. This guy right here, Albert Gallatin, or Gallatin, I don't know. Anyway, Albert. And Albert's going to go through, and he's going to reduce the national debt substantially. Remember, Hamilton had said that a relatively small, controlled national debt could be an asset. He didn't want it out of control. So Gallatin here, he's going to go through and he's going to work very hard on two aspects of life in regards to economics. One, paying down the national debt. We did reach zero at one point during the Jackson administration. At one point, this nation had zero debt whatsoever. Today, about $26 trillion. So, it took us a while to get to that point. Gallatin is working on reducing the debt and at the same time trying to force the government into something that most people have to deal with, most households have to deal with, but the government doesn't seem to have to deal with that. It's the idea of a balanced budget. Gallatin believed that the government should not spend more money than it was actually bringing in. It's the same concept of, let's say that you're all graduated, you have jobs somewhere, and you're earning, just for random notes, we'll say $1,000 a month. And let's say wherever you're living, you can live comfortably on that $1,000 a month. But instead of spending $1,000 a month, you get a whole bunch of credit cards and you're spending $1,500 a month. Now that can work out for a while. But eventually, if you're spending more money than you make, that eventually will come back to haunt you. And the same thing is true of nations. Gallatin wanted to try and make sure that the government was living within its means. And he did this by trying to balance the budget. He wanted to pay down the debt. All the sorts of things that most people think about are a good idea in regards to their personal life. He wanted the government to try and live by these same aspects. And this was Mr. Jefferson's choice. This was the president's choice to help run the economic aspect of the government. And so he had that support. Now, President Jefferson had done something really brilliant in his activities thus far. Remember we said that while he had tossed the excise tax, he had essentially kept the Hamiltonian system in place. What he had really done at this point was he had absorbed a lot of the major Federalist programs, okay? He comes into office as a Democratic Republican, but a lot of the programs that had been put in place by Presidents Washington and Adams, he's going to continue those Federalist programs going on. And really what this did was it showed the other party, it showed the Federalists, and it showed the people in general that just because there had been a change in administration, that there had been a new president, a new party come into power, that it did not necessarily mean that life was going to be disastrous for the party that was leaving power. Again, it's that concept of the peaceful transition of power. We change presidents periodically, we change Congresses periodically. But essentially what we're looking at here is the fact that just because your party is on the outs, this does not necessarily mean that everything is going to go bad for you. It also does not necessarily mean that if you've been working hard on a program for a long period of time, you don't have to worry that it's going to be scrapped just because you were in the quote-unquote wrong party. President Jefferson went through and absorbed these parties and helped everybody to see and understand that a change in regime did not necessarily mean that life was ending for the exiting group, and this would be a standard going forward. We've had a lot of presidents start a lot of new programs when they get into office, but 9 times out of 10, it is rare to see a president totally gut the entire program of the previous administration. Sometimes there are radical, huge changes from one president to the next. But more often than not, you're going to see a more gradual change in government instead of this, very gutting that I mentioned.